Hello and welcome to Contemplations. I am Josh and I am joined by Thomas.
Hello.
And we are going to be talking about the philosophy of aesthetics, and I have kind of constructed something to go through. We're going to talk about different philosophers' ideas on aesthetics, reading direct quotes just so you don't have to necessarily take our word for it if you don't want to, if our interpretations don't follow, and you can make up your own mind. However, I do have Thomas with me, who is in the process of doing a PhD in philosophy, so I feel like you're going to keep me on the right track.
I will try, because I'm not doing a
stuff.
philosophy in aesthetics, but I have some insights into the aesthetics of the German idealists.
When I asked you on the spot, you seem to know a fair amount about it. I think you're underselling yourself. So we're also going to talk about the objective-subjective debate in things like beauty and aesthetics in general, causes of perception of beauty, modern attitudes towards aesthetics, and how these have remained the same or changed over time. But first and foremost, what actually is aesthetics? Well, it can be narrowly defined as the theory of beauty, or more broadly in combination with the philosophy of art as well. And would you agree that that's roughly
more or less? It's one of the hardest things to define. It's something that you know exists because it refers to what you experience when you engage with a piece of art, but you don't know what you're, or shall we say, what exactly you're experiencing, how you're experiencing it, and why. And this is what the study of aesthetics essentially is, and why it's so interesting.
Absolutely. So let's take a look at a practical example then. So here we have the Rialto Bridge at night time, which is in Venice, and I've actually been here before, and I didn't find it beautiful because it was about 36 degrees Celsius, crammed full of tourists, and it's like the least conducive environment to appreciating beauty, because all I wanted to do was be in the shade, away from the hordes of people. But nevertheless, it looks very nice here. And then let's contrast that lovely bridge with this next one.
Oh,
this is a bridge in Fort Lauderdale in the US.
What an absolute atrocity.
Aesthetically, yes. However, this bridge is more practical, isn't it?
It is.
As a bridge, it's a better bridge because it can move its bridge part. I'm not an engineer, I'm sorry. But it can move to let boats to and fro.
Yeah.
And therefore, surely as a bridge, this is
Well, it
form.
captures almost the spirit of our present age, or the industrial age, you could say, function before image. And there is some virtue to that because it works much better as a bridge, considering what a bridge is for. But is that really what should ultimately guide how a bridge should be designed to look? Could you not, for example, design a bridge that is just as good, just as practical, but looks slightly better? Then again, having said that, if you put the Venetian bridge here, it would look somewhat out of place with everything else around it. So that might arguably constitute an even greater aesthetic atrocity.
Yeah, so obviously this tells us something about the nature of aesthetics and beauty in general, because it's not, as Aristotle might say, an object's beauty matches its ideal form. It's that there is something else to it, because of course the better bridge isn't the one that's the best looking. It's not that it's the most bridgiest bridge and therefore it's the best.
But the former is a work of art. That's not, clearly.
Yes. And I think if you ask people which one they thought was more aesthetically pleasing, I would imagine very, very few people would answer the latter, even though it is better at what it does, objectively speaking. I suppose in its function at the very least, maybe not in, I suppose you could say that its appearance is part of your evaluation, but even so, I'm sure about 95% of people would say, okay, the Rialto Bridge is way better than this one in Fort Lauderdale.
But in our rational universe, that would be the proper response to give. But then again, why make anything beautiful at all if function is put on a transcendent plane?
Well, I think that it's impossible to overlook things like beauty because it's an instinctual thing, isn't it? But before I get into the nature of it and what many prominent philosophers have to say and what we have to say about them, let's just talk about briefly the kind of philosophy of aesthetics as a sub-discipline of philosophy. And the term aesthetics, of course, comes from the ancient Greek, meaning to learn or to perceive, or that has more connotation to perceive. So there's already some acknowledgement that it's almost sensory, isn't it? And I think that that's relatively reasonable, of course.
Yes. You need sense data to have an aesthetic experience.
Yes. And of course, beauty in particular was a central theme of ancient Greek philosophy, which you can probably gather from their tendency to depict the human form and things of that nature in the idealized way.
Yeah.
And we'll get onto some examples of that in a second. They identified things such as proportion, functionality, and form. So obviously, functionality here is the thing that I was fighting against, because of course one bridge is more functional than the other, but that doesn't really follow with how we evaluate it.
No.
I don't think I need to put that to the population to know which one they're going to prefer, because it's entirely obvious. This is where the comment section is just like, I prefer the Fort Lauderdale Bridge, but there we go. So there's also things that are a bit more mathematical. For example, to Plato, the width of a face should be 2/3 of its height. So there's a mathematical example of a proportion. Of course, this didn't go away in medieval philosophy either. However, simply don't have the time to talk about this. But it became formalised as a philosophical subdiscipline in the 18th and 19th century, quite often in the opposition to rationalist notions of beauty, as, of course, rationalism in that sort of time was trendy, if you will, and they were trying to apply it to everything. And especially in the case of British empiricists who recognised judgments of beauty as being akin to sensory experience, they pushed back on this rationalist interpretation. So there are lots of people with interesting things to say. We're going to try and touch on some of them, but here's a quick list of some people. So Shaftesbury, Hutchinson, Hume, Burke, Kant, Schiller, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Hanslick, and Santayana. Don't know whether you're familiar with all of those.
I'm familiar with all of them, not all of their respective aesthetic theories, but no, they're probably the most amongst the most important figures on this in this debate.
But there's some avenues to, I suppose, for a bit of further study if you're interested, but we're not going to have the time to talk about all of them. We're already probably pressed for time with what we've got. So let's first of all outline this rationalist view that kicked off the whole debate in the 18th and 19th century. So they suggest that judgments of beauty are judgments of reason, apparently, that we judge things to be beautiful by reasoning it out, inferring from principles, or by applying concepts. This all sounds very academic, doesn't it? So you had groups in France, for example, such as Les Géométistes, a group of literary theorists who wanted to apply mathematical rigour to literature, and we have an example of a quote from one of these people from 1715. Excuse me, I am going to do a silly French accent.
No, go ahead.
It's
Can't
compulsory. The way, oh god, I can't bear myself to do it. No, I'm just going to read it. I'm not going to be able to keep it.
Just imagine your Baudrillard with a blocked nose.
That's not going to help. It says, the way to think about a literary problem is that pointed out by Descartes for problems of physical science. A critic who tries any other way is not worthy to be living in the present century. There is nothing better than mathematics as a proper pedeutic for literary criticism. So basically, this is one of the earliest examples of, it's the current year, guys. Anyone who isn't analysing literature with maths belongs in the 17th century. So yeah, trust the French to come up with something so pretentious, but there we go.
Yeah, there is an argument that can be made for numbers being causal, and if numbers are causal, then they are antecedent to aesthetic experience, which suggests that they could be rationalised in such a way. That is, if you take the Aristotelian philosophy of mathematics as opposed to the Platonian one, but it is rather pedantic, I accept.
I think that neither our understanding of literature or mathematics is good enough to apply to that scenario, and to be like, anyone who's doing anything else is just wrong and belongs in the past.
These are the same men of letters who probably thought that the French Revolution was a good idea. What was it, 80 years later? Or
exactly,
is it the
yes.
same class of people?
This is pre-French Revolution as well. So yeah, I don't understand how anyone can believe that. I feel like you've got to be on the autistic spectrum to want to apply numbers to things that clearly don't really work with them. So I'd like to kind of rebut this with a quote from I believe, another Frenchman, Baptiste Dubois, who said in 1719 in his book Critical Reflections on Poetry, Painting and Music, "Do we ever reason in order to know whether a ragout be good or bad? And has it ever entered into anybody's head, after having settled the geometrical principles of taste and defined the qualities of each ingredient that enters into the composition of those messes, to examine into the proportions observed in their mixture, in order to decide whether it be good or bad? No, this is never practice. We have a sense given us by nature to distinguish whether the cook acted according to the rules of his art. People taste the ragout, and though unacquainted with those rules, are unable to tell whether it be good or no. The same may be said in some respects to the productions of the mind, or the pictures made to please and move us."
Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree with this, obviously. And I really like the sake analogy there, talking about making a ragout. Of course, Frenchmen talking about food, again, living up to stereotypes.
Is it the same ragout as spaghetti bolognese? Because that's what spaghetti bolognese is apparently actually called in Italy.
Is it really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I'm
Just
the wrong person to ask.
Save that for a pub quiz later on.
But yes, obviously what this is trying to get at is that you don't think it out and then apply these abstract principles, because if you're tasting some food, you don't know what's gone into it.
No.
You just have the taste.
Yeah, you don't have a rational presupposed idea of what you're going to be eating, unless, of course, you know the ingredients, you know the constitution of that thing. But because you're not literally the chef, in the case of enjoying a piece of food that's being prepared for you, that aesthetic experience is going to be very, very different than if you made that yourself. So you could argue that you have a rationalistic idea of an aesthetic experience if you have previous experience with making that thing, that work of art. But nonetheless, that again shows that you need experience first to engage in the aesthetic. Yeah.
It can be said that things that you make for yourself can often taste better merely by merit of you making them. So there's some wiggle room, I suppose, if you're feeling charitable. But I don't know. I feel like the whole idea of applying rationalism to aesthetics is ridiculous.
It is, yeah.
So, moving on to someone who's got something a bit more reasonable to say is Hume, whose main contribution really is to say taste cannot entirely be subjective. And of course, I'm using things like taste, beauty as placeholders just to mean pleasing aesthetic experiences. So, please humour these various terms that are used. Of course, it doesn't remain consistent in the literature, the philosophical literature, that is, because of course, lots of different languages, lots of different time frames, and therefore it makes sense that the words change somewhat. But anyway, enough setting up. So this quote is from 1751, and he says, "In order to pave the way for a judgment of taste and give a proper discernment of its object, it is often necessary, we find, that much reasoning should precede, that nice distinctions be made, just conclusions drawn, distant comparisons formed, and complicated relations examined, and general facts fixed and ascertained. Some species of beauty, especially the natural kinds, on their first appearance, command our affection and approbation, and when they fail of this effect, it is impossible for any reasoning to redress their influence or adapt them better to our taste and sentiment. But in orders of beauty, particularly those of the fine arts, it is requisite to employ much reasoning in order to feel the proper sentiment." So, I take it you get what Hume is saying here.
More or less, yes. I mean, he's basically saying that beauty is predominantly what we understand as beauty, is sentimental and sensual. Anyone can attach sentimental value to anything, and each attachment to that is as I suppose, legitimate as the next. But it's a very different thing to say that is objective. To call something beautiful is of course according to what he's saying, is an expression of sentiment towards a certain object, but that is not the same thing as saying that something is objectively good. And there needs to be a distinction made between beauty and taste. And he's arguing essentially there is such a thing as good taste, and that's something that we can only understand with reference to the technical skills that are applied in the creation of that thing. But of course, sentiment is somewhat independent of that.
I also found it interesting that he mentions that any amount of reasoning cannot redress. So he's basically saying that to use modern language, I suppose, he's basically saying that our evaluations of things are unconscious, instinctual, and therefore no amount of conscious rationalisation can change our original perception.
It's absolutely folly to try to rationalise something or make sense of anything that precipitates or gives rise to an experience of that kind. And I think he's fundamentally right. We can't know why we have the reaction to the things that we do. I to this day don't understand why I hate mushrooms so much, but I do. It's not because of how they taste. I just can't stand the sight of them. I can't stand the thought of eating them. I can't rationalise that. I've tried my very hardest. I think this applies to many things, and I think to try to get to the root of it, of the cause of why we are disgusted and appeased or pleased by certain things, always does a disservice to the inquiry.
Well, I think that by examining something, you don't necessarily have to damage the thing. It's what's the phrase? It's like he who would take apart something to understand it, or to destroy something to understand it, misunderstands the point of it in the first place, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing the original quote, but I don't necessarily agree with that notion that you, by examining something, you somehow destroy it.
But it's how you examine it. Whereas what he's criticising is that rationalistic approach that we've been over.
Out of my kind of anecdotal experience with some things in the sciences, for example, I always find that a middling understanding is the least desirable. When you have no understanding at a rationalistic level, or like a more abstract conscious level, then it preserves the phenomenon's integrity. And on the inverse, if you have a full understanding or a near complete understanding of something, you can appreciate it perhaps in a different way, but perhaps even to an even greater degree. And it's that point in the middle where that sort of mid-level understanding.
But that moment of suspending judgment and closing an inquiry is, or shall we say, ceasing to close an inquiry is an essential part of aesthetic theory. It's that you're never going to understand something as a closed monad. It's an ongoing relation between yourself and that thing. And this is what I perhaps didn't explain very clearly is on the subject of reason. Hume is saying we can use our reason to decipher what is, I suppose, a good piece of art that's kind of put together with for a lot of technical skill, and that which is not. But that's not to say we should discredit people for the sentimental value they attach to objects that may not have that much skill, because that's purely just a matter of personal choice.
Yeah, and I very much agree with that, actually. I think there's a very good point there, and I think he's basically suggesting a similar thing to what I'm going to do later, which is try and explain things in a more scientific way later on. I'm going to basically talk about a bit of neuroscience, which kind of weighs in on the philosophy and gives you a bit of context. So it's not just so-and-so says this and that, and it's a tit-for-tat debate. There's a little bit of support from elsewhere. So we'll get onto that anyway. So one more quote from Hume in 1757, so he's had a little bit more time to think about it. Beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind of which contemplates them, and each mind perceives a different beauty. One person may even perceive deformity where another is sensible of beauty, and every individual ought to acquiesce in his own sentiment without pretending to regulate those of others.
So each aesthetic judgment in the sense of immediate experience is as legitimate as the next, but that's not to say that it's objectively a good form of art.
Yes, more or less. So, of course, here again, he's viewing taste or beauty or whatever you want to call it as an internal sense that is secondary to the external senses. So, moving on to Burke, this is one where I suppose he makes more of a useful distinction rather than contributing to the discussion about what is beauty and how do we form our opinions. So Burke mainly addresses this in his book called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, and that is 1757. So he basically divided aesthetic experiences, or at least some positive ones, between the sublime and the beautiful. And he tries to explain their causes through Aristotelian physics and metaphysics. So you're going to have to help me out a little bit here. So I did my best to understand this, but I mean, I'm certainly not.
Well, I'm
well-versed.
not an expert in Aristotelian metaphysics. My
Okay.
knowledge is kind of
But
fudged.
He outlines that the beautiful is that which is well formed and aesthetically pleasing. That's fair enough. I mean, you can't really dispute that. And he says that the formal cause is the passion of love, the material cause are the properties of the object, e.g., smoothness. The efficient cause is calming our nerves, and the final cause is God's providence or God's protective care.
Yeah, I mean, this seems very vague, doesn't it?
Yes, I don't really know what he's trying to get at, really.
No, I don't. He's speculating on the causality of what gives us that pleasurable experience, but I don't think something like you can deduce it to something like just smoothness, for example.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.